and something else. There is something that is interesting that I have with this chapter, and that's a couple of questionnaires, just so that you guys can kind of get to know yourself. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I won't really go into a lot of detail. If you want to do those questionnaires and then score them, they're relatively self-explanatory, but there is one that requires a little bit of reverse scoring that might be a little bit difficult. So I'll just sort of briefly talk about that. So I've given it a couple minutes. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the material. You may see some people popping in, and that's, of course, completely fine. And so I'll just sort of keep going. I do allow, of course, questions on chat or video. So if somebody comes in on that, then they get a chance to ask a question about the material. Okay, so we're starting out with this live lecture on Social Psychology Chapter 5, which is the self. And it's understanding ourselves in a social context. So remember, social psychology is really big on understanding sort of how we operate in groups, how we operate with other people, how we operate when people we think are watching us, how do we operate when we know people are watching us in a crowd versus not in a crowd, etc. So a lot of these concepts with the self are pretty basic, but I do want to kind of go over some of this so that you guys we're all on the same page. So when we think about what is the self, what's important here is to remember that not all animals we think have an understanding of their selves. So for example, you might have a dog or a cat, or you can find millions of videos on YouTube of puppies doing this. If you have a mirror and you take the puppy and you put it in front of a mirror, a lot of times what it does is it'll sort of rear up and it'll jump and it'll like bark. If you have a cat, they might do the sort of the cat thing where their spines kind of go up, and their tails might fluff out and their hair might go out and they might hiss or jump. And so if you put an animal in front of a mirror and it attacks the mirror or acts like that, what ends up happening is we understand that to be the animal doesn't recognize itself. And the animal is seeing this reflection and thinking it's another animal and, oh man, I need to attack it. So what we do to see if another animal can understand that it's looking at itself is that we do a little trick where an animal is anesthetized very briefly. Okay, so it's given anesthesia just to sort of knock it out for a second. And then something's painted on its forehead, like it might be like a paint or a spot or a sticker or something. Usually it's something that is, that it can't feel. So it might be just like, a piece of mark on the head. And then the animal wakes back up and then is presented with a mirror. And if the animal tries to attack the mirror, obviously it thinks that the animal is not itself, and so it's a different animal. But if it does anything to try to look at the spot, like for example, elephants, and there's a YouTube video on here that shows this, and it's really neat. Elephants, what they'll do is they'll take their trunks and they'll touch the spot that has the spot on their head, because they see themselves in the mirror and they know, okay, I can't see my head, but I'm looking at my reflection and I'm touching myself, on my head. And so we know that there are a lot of animals that do recognize themselves in mirrors. Dolphins, orcas, I believe crows have been shown to demonstrate self. We know gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans, they're all able to recognize themselves in the mirror. And elephants, of course, being another animal to do this. And so even humans aren't born with the capacity to recognize themselves in the mirror. If you have a young infant, for example, and you have the mirror in front of them, they'll look at the mirror, they may smile at the mirror, but they have yet to understand that that's actually their own reflection. It's not until about 2 years of age that children understand that that's them. And you can do this by presenting a mirror to a child, and if they say their own name, if they touch the mirror, touch themselves, if they have something on their face and they go to wipe it off, okay, they understand. But a lot of times 2-year-olds, what they'll do is they'll look at the mirror and they'll say their own name, and they recognize that that reflection is them. And so, of course, this kind of, is important in the understanding of who we are, important in the in understanding where it comes from. Okay, so we know that, we're not born with this idea of the self. It evolves, it matures over time. And then when we look at how it matures, you start with children and you ask yourselves, who are you? Ask a child, who are you? If you ask a child who is very young, like let's say 4 years old, they have very concrete explanations of who they are. If you ask a 6-year-old, who are you? They'll say, I am 6. I have a dad, and my dad looks like this, and I have brown hair, and I have blue eyes, or I have brown eyes, or I am, this. It's very concrete. It's very factual. They may say, I like playing basketball, and so their understanding of themselves is very basic and very, sort of factual and concrete. As we start to mature and our concept of ourselves, or our self-concept starts to mature, we stop thinking about, okay, if I ask you as an adult, a college student, who are you? Very unlikely you're going to say, I am X amount of years of age. I am, I have blue hair. I don't know. Maybe you do have blue hair. And that would be a pretty good characteristic. Maybe, you wouldn't say I have blonde hair. I have black hair. I have, blue eyes. I have brown eyes. You probably would say something like, who are you sort of, deep down inside? I'm honest. I'm a nice person. I am giving. I value my family. And so, focusing on this idea of self-concept is a lot less physical and much more, who we are. I am happy. I am, I'm glad to be here. It's much more emphasis on this physical, psychological state rather than physical characteristics. And you also change your answer based on who asks you. If I as a professor asks you who you are, your mother asks who you are, a friend asks who you are, an acquaintance, or somebody that is maybe a religious figure, your answer will change based off of who asks you, and it also change based off of how you feel in terms of how that person's judging you. And so your answer to a really good friend, it will be different from an acquaintance. And so this is a maturing or a matured self-concept, understanding who you are based off of everyone around you, and understanding who you are much more deeper than these just physical characteristics. And of course, you're maturing over time. So here again, this is an example of, giving an infant or a young child a mirror and seeing, do they understand who they are? When they see that, do they recognize that person as themselves? And we know, of course, that this idea of self is important for understanding how you fit in with other people. It's important in understanding your own self-esteem. It's important in a lot of different concepts. Another thing that really plays into how you view yourself is culture. Now, I'm going to talk about culture in the sense of, I want you to think of this kind of twofold. So on one hand, I want you to think about culture as being where you're from the world, right? And you can think of culture as where you're, who you are in scope of in the United States, and you can think of who you are in the scope of the world. You can think of who you are in the scope of where you live. And we're kind of going to be talking globally at first about this idea of self. So there's two proverbs here. One is an American proverb and one's a Japanese proverb, and they actually mean completely opposite things. So an American proverb, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, which means that if you are annoying enough and loud enough and you scream about something and you complain about something, that somebody's going to do something to quiet you. So they'll appease you, right? So if you order something at a restaurant and it's not exactly what you want, and let's say you said no tomatoes and there's tomatoes on it, the idea is if you're like, hey, look, can you please remove the tomatoes, then somebody's going to go, okay, well, we'll go ahead and appease you. Same thing with this idea of big, like think bigger, like the rights of women. And the right to vote, this idea that, hey, you keep going out there and you protest and you talk about it and you say, I want, all women should have the right to vote. Okay. Because obviously at one point we did not have the right to vote. And you complain enough about it, yell enough about it, argue enough about it, then granted the right to vote, equal rights. So, this idea that this is an American ideology that, you need to be loud in order to get what you want. Now, the Japanese proverb actually means complete opposite. The nail that stands out gets pounded. If you yell and scream loud enough, they're going to quiet you, but not in a way that appeases you. They're going to be like, shut up or you will die, sort of thing. So the idea is that you don't yell out, you don't, make waves, and you don't cause a fuss, because that's disgraceful, and that is something that, you will get punished for. So these are very two dynamic sort of proverbs and ideas, but it makes sense based off of Japanese culture and American culture. So we're going to talk about this idea of independent versus interdependent views. So in Western cultures, America is included in that. Of course, England is also included in this idea of Western ideology and independent views. This idea, this independent view of the self, is thinking about oneself in of themselves. So your own internal thoughts, how you feel, how you behave, how you act. And it's not based off of your family. It's not based off of your friends. It's not based off of your country or culture. It's based off of you. This idea of the American dream, this idea of going out and getting what you want, this idea of how am I affected by this? How do I feel about this? How am I offended by this? This is a very independent view. It's independent of other people. Okay. And of course, the opposite of that is this interdependent view. And we see this in non-Western cultures, a lot of Asian cultures, Japan, China, things like this. The view of the self is not based on the self. It's actually based off of family and people around you. And so you define yourself not by yourself, but you define yourself by by other people, by the people around you. And so this is a very strong understanding that your behavior, your actions, and who you are is very dependent upon other people. It's very dependent upon your family, based upon, dependent upon your culture, dependent upon your country, dependent upon, the people that you surround yourself with. And so remember that we're thinking about this globally. So when we talk about independent versus interdependent, we're talking about America as a whole. Let's say Japan as a whole, China as a whole, in terms of culture versus culture. Just because you come from a country that has a culture that's interdependent doesn't mean every single individual is going to take an interdependent view of themselves. So I'll give you an example of looking at this in a smaller scope. So we know that, for example, in the US as a whole, most people have this independent view of themselves. Well, if you start going into different regions of the United States, for example, a very rural region that's very where people sort of stay with family, they don't tend to move a lot, they are concentrated in a particular area. For example, Southwest Virginia, we actually see a lot more interdependent people, or people viewing themselves in an interdependent way than independent. And so it can vary based off of area. Okay, so it's not specific. It doesn't mean that every single person in the US is this way. And of course, not everybody in an interdependent view culture views themselves in that way. When we look at, for example, Masako Awada, she married at 29. She was educated at Harvard, educated at Oxford. They thought she was going to be this just world-renowned foreign diplomat. She spoke like 5 languages. She was incredibly intelligent and incredibly educated, and had this wonderful career ahead of her. So well traveled, well spoken, and she actually married the Prince of Japan in the 90s. And so what ended up happening was, obviously, Awada did not have an independent view of herself. She had an interdependent view of herself. She had a very independent view of herself. She was educated in the United States, educated in England. She went out and got what she wanted. She wanted to be educated. She made it happen. She wanted a career for herself. And when you look at Japanese culture, very traditional culture, this is very much against what they really preach. Okay, this is very much against the culture. Because the idea is traditionally the wife is not supposed to go off to the States and get, educated, not supposed to have a career, not supposed to do all these things. Very traditional Japanese, her job was to entertain. Her job was to have people come from all over, and she's supposed to entertain them. She's supposed to be in the shadows. She's not supposed to be out, communicating in the same way that the prince was. And so there was this kind of separation in Japan. We had one side going, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. You're going, because she ended up having to go back into these traditional roles. We had this one side saying, that's super fantastic. Yes, you should, because of your family, no matter what you think, you should, be traditional roles, even if you're unhappy, even if it doesn't matter, your job is to serve your husband, right? So we had this group, this group, very traditional, saying, super, very interdependent view of themselves. Do what you do for your country, do what you do for your husband, right? Then we had this other group of people who had this interdependent view, Japanese, who were just furious. They were so angry. They were like, look, you went from having this brilliant career to imprisoning yourself into a traditional role in Japan. Why on earth would you do this? And so there was a lot of anger from some people of why she would do this. And it turns out that this role, this of falling back into this traditional role, did not suit her very well. She ended up being very reclusive. She was not adjusting well to that traditional role. She wanted to be out there doing her thing, and she was stuck, and she wasn't, able to leave. She had to do all of these, household duties that are specific to women in Japanese culture, and she wasn't happy. And so what ended up happening, of course, is that she ended up having to sort of go away from being in public. She was sort of very reclusive. She had, they kind of labeled it as sort of like a mental condition where she had adjustment disorder. And she didn't get to go out and do the things that she wanted to do. And so it didn't fit her well because she didn't have the right view of herself according to her specific culture. And because the royalty in Japan was so specific to having these very specific traditional roles, it didn't help her she wasn't able to step out of that. And so, just because somebody is brought up in a culture where it's more, the majority is more interdependent or dependent, doesn't mean, or independent, doesn't mean that that person is going to adopt that view of themselves. And then we also look at, so we have this culture aspect, but we also have a gender aspect. Now, if you notice in the course, there's kind of this line where there are some slides that say, okay, well, here are the gender differences of, male versus female. And then there's a lot of other sides that say that we're really not that different. And to be honest with you, we're really not that different, men and women compared to each other. But we do see specific stereotypes associated with each gender. For example, we see women talking more about interpersonal things, problems, relationships, gossiping with her friends, sort of thing. And then the other stereotype with men is that, they will talk about anything except their feelings. They will go to, a sports game, and maybe they're going through a hard patch in their relationship, and they refuse to talk about anything related to their relationship. And these are really big stereotypes. But of course, we know that not every woman likes to talk about her feelings or talk about problems. And not every man is only focused on, anything but feelings. And so these stereotypes are very strong, and they are very pervasive in our culture. But we do know that there are some differences in terms of how men and women start in terms of their development of themselves. And the question is, do we push that as a culture? Is that a genetic thing? Is it a cultural thing? And we find that it's very specifically cultural in our country. We find that many American girls tend to develop very, very intimate relationship, and mostly with other girls very early on. They tend to be more cooperative and play better with other children, other girls. They tend to focus more on social relationships versus things like sports and different kinds of play. And of course, remember, these are things that are specific to the US. In America, boys tend to focus more on group membership. They tend to be a little less cooperative in play with other children. But we see that a lot of this tends to be in things like sports and team sports, and seeing themselves as a part of, a fraternity, so to speak, of boys, not like a college fraternity, but a fraternity of other boys. So gender does play a role in how we view ourselves. And that, of course, is very deeply rooted into the culture of where you're from and where you grew up. And so, we can get a lot of information based off of where you were brought up. Was it, what country was it? Was it rural? Was it, more family oriented? What was it? And so one thing that I want to comment on in terms of some of the questionnaires that I have available for you guys to do, one of them is a specific interdependent versus independent view of the self. And so based off of how you answer the questions and score it, you can see, where you fall under. And just because you grew up in a rural area, let's say you grew up in Southwest Virginia, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a particular, viewpoint. Just because you grew up in the United States doesn't mean you're going to have a particular viewpoint. So I want to kind of remind you guys that if you get an answer that you weren't really expecting, let's say you go, well, most Americans have an independent view of themselves, but I have an interdependent. It could be explained by, the more rural area. If you grew up here, if you grew up in a bigger city, you might reflect more on to typical American, patterns. So, just because you might score differently doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. But when we think about figuring out who we are, and looking at how we view ourselves, we can do a process called introspection. And this is actually a way to view yourself in therapy. Okay, so if you go to a psychoanalytic type of psychologist, they'll use introspection a lot and say, think about yourself. How does that make you feel? You hear this typical sort of psychologist, right? Paint this picture in your head of a psychologist sitting and taking notes, and somebody's lying on a chaise or a bed, and someone saying, tell me how that makes you feel. Well, that is actually introspection defined. How does that make you feel? How does that, what are you thinking? Why did you do that? What are your motives? This introspection is a way for you to understand yourself a little bit better, right? So a lot of times counselors want you to understand why you do the things that you do, and reflect upon yourself and reflect inward. But the problem is that we don't do it very often, and we don't do it usually unless we are prompted. And so what we tend to do is not really sit and think about it a lot. And so another reason why we don't understand why we do the things that we do is honestly because it could be, outside of what we know about ourselves. It's this sort of outside of conscious awareness. In order for introspection to work really well, you need to kind of know yourself a little bit. You need to be able to understand yourself a little bit. And so, one major aspect of this is, if you don't know yourself, it's outside of your conscious awareness, then introspection isn't going to help you if you don't have that insight about who you are. And so another thing that kind of plays in this idea of introspection and thinking about yourself is this idea of self-awareness theory. And so we tend to evaluate ourselves when there is spotlight shown on us, right? And so this could be like you are looking at yourself in a video. Maybe, somebody took a video of you on their phone and then, posted it to social media and you're watching yourself. Another way to kind of see yourself is looking in the mirror. And so this idea of focusing on your own self, right? But comparing yourself and your behavior to who you think you are. So we all have standards and values that we have as part of who we are. So if I asked you to jot down, what 3 most important things to you, okay? It could be like your family, it could be your education, it could be, sports, athletics, it could be, your occupation, it could be your job, your career, whatever your values are, right? And it varies based off of every individual. Thinking about who you are and your own values, and then other values like, what do you value in a person? What do you value in yourself? Honesty, maybe you value being kind. All of these things are sort of things that are important to you. And then you think about your standards. Well, do you meet your own standards? Are you kind? Are you generous? Are you happy? Are you good? And so self-awareness theory is focusing on yourself and evaluating yourself. Do you meet your own standards? Do you meet your own values? And are you on track with who you want to be? Well, of course, and this is sort of a little like schematic here, this idea that if you are caught in a mirror and you see yourself, or see yourself in a video, or hear a recording of yourself, this puts the spotlight on you, right? And it allows you to, it's a cue in your environment, and it allows you to evaluate yourself for a moment. Now, if you evaluate yourself and you go, all right, you know what? I'm where I want to be. I'm happy with myself. This is good, right? Then everything's great. You're good. You just move on. You leave it, right? And then you continue on until the next cue comes along. If you don't feel like you are who you are, let's say you're in a store and you want to steal something, okay? Let's say that's on your mind. Let's say you want to do it. Okay, let's not talk about right and wrong. Let's just say you're like, I'm in a store and I want that pack of gum, and I'm gonna take it. I'm not gonna pay for it because, F the police, whatever, okay? Let's say there's a mirror there, okay? And you go to reach for the gum and you look in the mirror and you think for a second, you're like, is this who I am? Right? You have 2 choices. You ask, is this who I am? You can go, you know what? This is dumb. Whatever. It's stupid. I'm taking the gum. Whatever. Okay. So you sort of like flee from this idea. You put it aside and you ignore it. And you're like, dumb. That's dumb. Stupid mirror. Whatever. It's cool. I am who I am. Whatever. So you're sort of fleeing from this self-awareness state because it makes you uncomfortable. Okay. That's one choice. Or you can reach for the gum and go, this is not who I am. And then you don't take the gum, right? And so this is a change in your behavior. And that change in behavior is what ends up working to change who you are. So you are able to meet your standards. So you change your behavior so it matches your standard for yourself. And then you feel good about it. You're like, you know what? I'm good. Okay. I'm good. And we're going to see this idea of options that you have in other chapters of like self-justification, right? So you're confronted with this conflict. And we call this cognitive dissonance, right? This conflict. Who you are, how you're acting, who you're being doesn't match who you want to be. Okay. You're a health nut. Right? You exercise regularly, you eat really well, but you smoke. not a healthy behavior. That is a conflict there. What do? Do you change the behavior? Okay, if you're caught up in yourself and you see a mirror, or you see yourself smoking on a video and you go, gosh, you know what? That conflicts with who I am. I'm supposed to be healthy. I'm supposed to love my body and enjoy what I put in it. And I don't want to poison myself. I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit smoking. Or you ignore it, right? You go, this is too much. This is too much. And I do not want to face this. Ignore. And then you move on. So this kind of concept will follow throughout. You'll notice this sort of follow throughout different themes in this class. So the times where we are faced with this conflict and we ask ourselves, is this who we are? That is uncomfortable and we don't like that. And that's why it's called this dissonance, right? Why I don't want to feel this way. I don't like feeling this way. And a lot of times we try to escape ourselves because we don't want to face who we are. And we know deep down that our actions, our thoughts, our behaviors, our being is not matching up to our standards and values. So what we do is, because it can be very aversive and we want to turn it off, some people will do things that are damaging, like drink alcohol, do drugs, and then harm themselves in different ways. Cutting, things like that can take that focus off of their self for a little while. And what people can do is, of course, do it too much. So, of course, we all know at least one person who does alcohol and drugs, and they do it because they don't want to know themselves. They don't know how to be comfortable in their own skin, and they get freaked out whenever the attention's placed on them, where they have to think about themselves. They don't want to face what they're doing. They don't want to face how they're acting. They don't want to face who they are. And so they turn to an escape, right? So they get high or they get drunk, and they no longer have to think about themselves because they're in a state that takes that limelight off of themselves, that spotlight off of themselves and onto them and whatever else, right? But sometimes this idea of focusing on yourself isn't always bad. It isn't always damaging. So for example, when you graduate, right? Yes, self-focus is fantastic. That's great because you can, celebrate your achievements, and then you can go, okay, now where am I going from here? What am I doing now? Where are we going with this? And so it can be really great to focus on yourself and to think about who you are and to know that you're doing your best to be better at whatever it is that you're doing, right? So self-focus can be very helpful. Also, it can help remind you of sense of right and wrong. So you know what? Sometimes people need to see themselves doing something and they go, I need to change myself. And then it stops becoming aversive and starts becoming helpful. So for example, if you do, let's say you drink too much and you see a video of yourself and you're super drunk and you're like, I don't like this. I'm going to change this. This is helpful. This tells me what I need to do. And then you become a better person and become a healthier person because you choose not to do that anymore. Or you're in a situation where, you realize people are watching you and you need to be better. And then you introspect into that and go, I need to be better because I need to be better for myself. And so that can be very helpful. And so self-awareness theory thinks about all of these things and puts this together and say, okay, when we're aware of ourselves, this is what can happen. It can be aversive. It can change behavior. We can ignore it. It can be helpful. So all these different sort of things. Now, when it comes to the motivation as to why we do certain things, I'm thinking about ourselves, thinking about who we are. there are two major types of motivation. And of course, there's a lot more to this, and we're going to go into just the basics of the idea of motivation and motivating ourselves. There's the intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And sometimes people call this internal motivation and external motivation. It's the same idea. So intrinsic is we like to do something because we like it. We find it interesting. It makes us happy. We don't do it because of money. We don't do it because of pressure, from our parents, or pressure from a friend, or pressure from a social group. We do it because we like to do it. Reading is a really good example of this. So some people just love to read. They like to read. They don't need somebody telling them to read. They don't need somebody paying them, or finding an external reward like good grades, for example, to read their textbook. They just read because they like to read. Extrinsic motivation would be that you engage in an activity not because you enjoy it, not because you find it interesting, but because you're sort of paid to do it. You could be rewarded with good grades, rewarded with praise, rewarded with money. And these are things that we are externally stimulating, and the reason why you do the things that you do. Now, sometimes we can find a mix, and we're not going to go into detail about sort of the mix of things that we, find it, maybe sort of internally, but sort of externally rewarding. We're just going to focus on sort of the basics of internal versus external of motivation. Things can start out as intrinsically motivating. And I'm going to use another example here of reading. It can start out as being, a really good thing. You really love it. You enjoy reading so much, and you want to read all the time. Then it can become extrinsically motivating. And this can be problematic when we see this in reading programs in children. So I know when I was younger, there was a reading program that I was involved with in school. And if you read X amount of books, you get like a pizza party, right? So you think this is great for all the kids that don't like to read because it gets them to read. But it's actually harmful. It can be potentially harmful to reward the children externally who already intrinsically enjoy reading. Okay, so this sounds counterintuitive. It sounds interesting because you think, well, if you take somebody and they like doing the thing that they do, and then you pay them for it, they should like it better, right? And actually, they don't. They actually start to decrease their love for something. So, if they're for example, let's say they're an artist, okay, and they love to draw, and they draw all the time. They love it. It's the best thing ever. And then they find a job where they can actually do what they love, and they get paid for it. They have to do it every single day, and it's something that that they have to do. That changes sometimes people's love of that thing. So they may go, and now I don't love it anymore. I don't do it because it's something that I enjoy. I do it because I have to. And so that kind of mindset of I do it because I have to, I do it because I have to make money, I do it because I get the reward, can change your internal motivation for seeking out doing that thing. And so there's a, in your, let's see here. Yeah. So this is basically what I just sort of described here. This idea of this particular, study that was done in reading programs in children, this idea that children, well, actually this was not a reading program. This kind of is the same idea as a reading program, but this is with math, a math game. And so essentially you can see at the left part here, this was when the children were not getting any rewards. So we call this our baseline. And as you can see that this course of the experiment lasted about 2 weeks or so. So this is a block of each block of days. And so at first you can see that the kids were playing the game for about 15 minutes. And then it peaked about a week in at a little over 25 minutes. And then it sort of dropped off and plateaued. So you see these children were having a good time playing this math game, okay, with this peak of being about 26, 7 minutes total amount of play. when you introduce a reward program, okay, you can see here that it does work because they do increase the amount of time they play the math game to almost 30 minutes. But notice that it'll drop off, okay, and then level out, but they're still doing more time, okay, in the end, than they did at baseline. So they're playing the game longer. They like it. They get rewarded. When you take those rewards away, as you can see, at first, it starts out being sort of intrinsically rewarding in the same sense of where it started out before, a baseline, about a little over 15 minutes. But notice that drop off. When you remove the rewards, and those kids are expected to play this game on their own accord, they have lost the love of playing the game. So it dropped to 5 minutes of play. And if we continue this graph and continue the experiment after 2 weeks, we can assume that it drops off to 0. They no longer want to play. They're not getting rewarded. They don't find it enjoyable anymore because they were paid for it. Now they're doing it for free, okay? Now they're no longer enjoying it. So we refer to this as the over-justification effect, where you're trying to justify why you want to play this game, and you sort of overreach that goal when you're getting rewarded. But then when you take those rewards away, there's no reason for you to justify playing that game anymore. You don't like it anymore, and you're not getting paid for it. Why bother? And so this can be really dangerous when you're doing something like a reading program, or, in this case, math game, because you want kids to enjoy these things intrinsically, and that's how they're going to get better at them and like it for a longer period than, just when they're getting the rewards. And so that, of course, brings us to this idea of mindset. So when we are thinking about how we're able to do what it is that we do, how good at reading are we? How good at math are we? So this idea of, okay, so what is intrinsically rewarding? What is extrinsically rewarding? Okay. Are we motivated internally or externally? Okay. And how do we view ourselves and how we're able to do things? What are our abilities, right? So there are 2 basic mindsets. And again, there's a lot more to this, but we're just going to the basics. And your book will go into a little bit more detail here. This idea of fixed versus growth mindset. So a fixed mindset is, no matter what I do, I will never get better at this, right? So let's say you think that you have a fixed mindset on your ability to play basketball. You say to me, I can